Why do people fail to control their impulses? Now, this question has baffled scientists for decades. Humans have the most sophisticated brain machinery of any animal on the planet, and so you might expect that they would never fail to control their impulses. Now, we know that that's not the case. Whether you look at the scientific literature or your own life, we all have problems controlling our impulses. In fact, one recent group of researchers wanted to see how often people fail. And what they did was they simply beeped people throughout the day. And they asked them a couple of simple questions. The first question was, have you tried to control your impulses since the last time that we beeped you? If participants said yes, they asked them a follow-up question. Did you succeed or did you fail? To the researchers' shock, participants failed to control their impulses 50% of the time. Now that's a lot. So one thing that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to answer this question is that we're starting from a place where we're all having problems. Now, one reason why we're having problems controlling our impulses is that we simply don't understand how self-control works. Now, in recent years, a group of researchers have proposed that one way that self-control works is as a limited energy resource. When we try to control our impulses, it draws on this common energy resource, and it becomes depleted. And what happens is when we become depleted of our self-control energy, we have less of that left over for when we have to complete a subsequent attempt at controlling our impulses. So this perspective is what's known as the limited energy resource model of self-control. Now, there are a couple of other ways to think of how self-control works. One of them is that self-control, instead of representing a limited energy resource, is more of a skill, just like any other skill that we would have. So instead of our self-control performance changing over time, our self-control should remain very consistent over time, just like with any other skill that we have. A third perspective, an alternative way of thinking of how self-control works, is that it's a knowledge resource. Now, you can think of a knowledge resource as something that becomes smarter and smarter the more that you use it. So from this perspective, the more that you use your self-control, the better off you're going to be. The more that you practice, that you use it, it doesn't deplete you, it makes you smarter, it makes you better, and you're going to have a lot more self-control success. Now, this idea that the self and our identity and our ability to control our impulses relies on a limited energy resource isn't something new. Since the beginning of psychology, researchers and theorists have thought of the mind as an energy system. All that we have to do is go back to Sigmund Freud and think of some of his early writings. Freud conceptualized the mind as a large energy system. It was a system in which people were constantly going to battle against themselves. People have instincts, drives, and motives to do things. And sometimes the things that we're driven to do, these instincts, aren't very appropriate. So we have to have other components of ourself in order to remain in agreement with what's appropriate, either from what society tells us is appropriate or based on our current beliefs. So Freud got a lot of things wrong in his life. And one thing that he got wrong was why we control our impulses. But he was completely right that our mind functions as an energy system. So if we're going to try to understand why people fail to control their impulses so often, we have to understand how self-control works. And now what we're going to do is we're going to see how these three different perspectives on self-control work out. within the context of some classic experiments. Let's look at two experiments that have tested the limited resource model of self-control. The first experiment is the classic cookie and radish experiment. College students came into a laboratory and they sat down at a table. They parked their backpacks and then they received some instructions. The experimenter told them that this experiment was about taste testing, and so they were going to taste some foods and then complete some unrelated tasks. Next, half of the participants were given special instructions. They were shown a plate of food, and the plate contained two different types of food. On one side of the plate, there were chocolate chip cookies, and the experimenters had just baked them. They smelled delicious. On the other half of the plate, there were radishes. And for these participants, the experimenter told them, you can have as many of those radishes as you want to, but do not eat those chocolate chip cookies. The idea was that it would take a lot of self-control to resist eating these tempting foods. The other half of the participants had a much easier time of it. The experimenter told them the opposite. They said, eat as many of those chocolate chip cookies as you want to, but do not eat those radishes. So the idea was that for half of these participants, they would become depleted of their mental energy because they had to resist temptation. Next, what the experimenters did was they measured participants' self-control. And to do this, they gave them a series of puzzles to solve. But what they didn't tell these participants is that the puzzles were unsolvable. Persistence in the face of failure is a core feature of self-control. And so what the experimenters did was they simply wanted to see how long participants persisted. As they predicted, participants who had resisted temptation, who had become depleted of their mental energy, they persisted for a lower amount of time compared to participants whose self-control energy had not been depleted. So next, what the experimenters wanted to do was conduct a second study to not only replicate what they had found, but also to extend it in a different way. This is what's known as the white bear study. So participants came into a laboratory, they sat down at a table, and they were told to write a brief essay. Now, for half of these participants, they were simply told to write an essay using normal, everyday activities and words and no special instructions. But the other half of the participants, they got those instructions, but then there was a key switch. For these participants, the experimenter told them, whatever you do when you're writing your essay, do not think of a white bear. If you catch yourself thinking of a white bear, get that thought out of your head. Suppress the idea of a white bear. So for these participants, they had to exert a lot of self-control, because anytime you tell people not to do something, they do it more. And it would take self-control to do that, to suppress thoughts of a white bear, and that might deplete people's mental energy. What the researchers found was that suppressing thoughts of a white bear did wear people out and made them mentally exhausted. And the reason they knew that is because those participants later on showed the poorest self-control. So whether it's resisting tempting food or trying to suppress thoughts of a white bear, our ability to control our impulses is fragile. It's based on a limited energy resource. So when we use that, we become depleted. And we suffer in terms of our ability to control our impulses later on. Now that we have a good understanding of how self-control works, we can take the next step. We can apply our findings to the brain. We've been talking about how self-control relies on a limited energy resource. So when people expend self-control, they deplete themselves of their self-controlled energy. And what happens is when they try to control themselves later on, oftentimes they experience failure. So why does this happen? What's going on in the brain that's causing people to have so many problems controlling their impulses when they try to resist tempting foods or other sorts of tasks that sap their self-control energy? Well, recently, a group of researchers have asked this question, and they tested it within the context of two competing hypotheses. One hypothesis is that when people are depleted of their self-control energy, they simply have difficulty monitoring themselves, keeping track of what's going on, their thoughts, their feelings, and their behaviors, how their current actions are stacking up against what's the most desirable action. So that's one possibility. And the good thing about it is that there's a specific region of the brain that controls monitoring. It's called the anterior cingulate cortex. A second hypothesis that these researchers tested is that when people are depleted of their self-control energy, they simply have less of an ability to override impulses once they have them. So it's not as if being depleted of your self-control energy makes you unable to monitor what you're doing, or what you're feeling, or even what you're thinking. It simply depletes you of the strength, of the energy to override an urge once you have it. So to test this hypothesis, what the researchers did was they brought participants into a laboratory, and they had them sit down in a scanner using functional magnetic resonance imaging, or fMRI. And what they wanted to do was they wanted to place these participants in situations that either would or would not deplete them of their self-control energy. And what they did was they constructed a version of watching television that would be depleting or not depleting. So how do they do this? Well, I think we've all watched the television where there are lots of things going on. Maybe there's the main program that we're watching, but then underneath that, there are also things that are going on. Maybe there are updates on scores. Maybe there are updates on news stories. We're all used to this. It doesn't take self-control to watch TV. But it does take self-control when I tell you, whatever you do not look at the words at the bottom of the screen. If you catch yourself looking down there, redirect your attention to the middle of the screen, to the main program. By telling you not to do something, you're going to be more likely to do it. And that's exactly what the researchers asked these participants to do. In the depleting condition, they set up a situation in the fMRI machine where they had to control their attention in that very way. In the non-depleting situation, participants were simply told to watch the screen like they would normally watch television. And after that, all participants were given an opportunity to control their impulses. So which of these two hypotheses received more support? The monitoring hypothesis or the strength hypothesis? Well, as these researchers predicted, when people were depleted of their self-control energy, they showed less activation in that brain region that's helpful in overriding impulses. There were no differences found in the monitoring region of the brain, the anterior cingulate cortex. So what these results tell us is that when people are depleted of their self-control, one reason why they have failures when they try to control their impulses later on is not because they can't monitor themselves. It's not because they don't know what they're doing. It's simply that they have limited strength, limited energy. And by having limited energy, people often succumb to desires that they know aren't appropriate, but they simply don't have the strength to overcome. We've been talking about how self-control works, how it's extremely fragile. It depends on a limited energy resource that becomes depleted when we use it. And when we have depleted self-control energy, it can have disastrous consequences for our subsequent self-control attempts. We've been talking about these things as they function for most people in most situations, and there's some value to that. But I think we can all agree that we're not the same. We're unique. We have unique traits, characteristics, motivations, and experiences that we bring with us to different situations. And it's this uniqueness that might better help us explain why people fail to control their impulses in some situations and not in others. So researchers have begun to explore this in a couple of different ways. And today we're going to talk about two experiments that have explored these possibilities. Now, the first experiment looked at eating behavior. Now, eating is something that we all do and that many of us experience a lot of self-control failure with, whether it's that we're eating too much or we're eating the wrong things. We're constantly trying to override our impulses with regards to our eating behavior. But some people do this more than others. Some people are constantly watching what they eat and restraining their impulses to eat certain things so that they can eat other things. These people are what we call restrained eaters. Now, researchers have tested whether depleting situations are different for restrained eaters compared to other people. And so in one study, what these researchers did was they brought a bunch of people into the laboratory, some of whom were restrained eaters and others who weren't. And what they did was they put them in the presence of some extremely tempting food: Doritos, M&Ms, and Skittles. These are all things that aren't very good for us, but often tempt us in a lot of different ways. The idea was that simply being around these foods might be tempting, and it might require more self-control energy to override your impulse not to eat them for restrained eaters compared to unrestrained eaters. So how did they do this? Well, what they did was they sat participants down in a chair, and for half of them, they put the food right next to them in close physical proximity, and they left them there for a few minutes. The idea is that this would be extremely exhausting to do, especially for people who were restrained eaters. The other half of the participants had a much easier time of it. The tempting food was still in the room, but it was on the opposite end, out of sight, out of mind. Next, what the researchers did was they measured participants' self-control by seeing how much ice cream they would eat. And what they found was that when participants had been depleted of their self-control energy, they ate more ice cream. But this was especially true among chronic restrained eaters. When restrained eaters were put in the presence of some very tempting food, they had to exert even more self-control, and that led them to eat more ice cream later on. Now, eating isn't the only thing that we do to control our impulses, and where personality traits and experiences are important to take into account. Sexual behavior is another one of them. So, relationships often change the longer you've been in them. And one thing that changes is passion. Now, although some people are passionate for years and years and years, oftentimes the most passionate phase of your relationship is toward the beginning. During this phase of your relationship, you often have to exert self-control over your passionate feelings for your partner, your desire to be around your partner all the time, or even to engage in sexual behavior with your partner. So when you're depleted of your self-control energy and you're in the new stages of a relationship, you might be more likely to engage in sexual behavior. This is exactly what happens. Studies have shown that when people are depleted of their self-control energy, and when they're new in their relationship, that they engage in more sexual behavior. Whereas people who have been in their relationships for a long amount of time, who might not have to override their passionate feelings for their partner, when they're depleted of their self-control energy, it doesn't have much of an impact on their sexual behavior. So what these studies show us is not only the importance of understanding how self-control relies on a limited energy resource, but on the validity and the importance of taking into account people's unique characteristics, traits, and experiences that they bring with them to these situations. Because it's by understanding the complexity of how situations and personality traits interact that we can better understand why some people fail and why some people succeed when trying to control their impulses. Where does self-control energy come from? We understand how self-control works, and we also understand some of the neural mechanisms underlying self-control processes, but what we haven't looked at are some biological processes that are involved in self-control. Now, there are many things that are involved, and as my colleagues and I began to explore this very question, we ran some experiments. The first experiment was simply to see if we gave participants an opportunity to indulge themselves, if this would offset some of the negative effects that we were observing when people were depleted of their self-control energy. So in this experiment, participants were depleted of their self-control energy or not, and then what they were given an opportunity to do was indulge themselves by eating a tasty milkshake. Another group of participants were given a beverage to drink, but it was a gloppy mess. It had lots of calories in it, but it was mostly made out of half and half in water. And then there was a third group of participants who simply read magazines as a distraction task. After this, participants were given a self-control task that measured their persistence in the face of failure. Now, the results were surprising. Participants who did indulge themselves didn't suffer as much when they were depleted. But we found very similar results among participants who drank the gloppy mess. So we looked at the results and we were scratching our heads. And after a few minutes of discussing the results, we thought, well, maybe it's the calories. Maybe it's the energy that's offsetting these effects of self-control depletion. Now, about 10 years later, we have numerous studies that have confirmed this possibility. That by giving people a boost of metabolic energy, that it offsets the effects of depleted self-control energy. Whether it's coping with the prospect of your own mortality, delaying gratification, or engaging in other acts of self-control. By giving people a boost of metabolic energy, it tends to help their self-control. But how far can we extend this? If giving people a boost of metabolic energy helps them control their impulses, well, might there be a common biological process that we could observe in animals that don't even have a sense of self? That is, can we understand self-control processes in animals that have no sense of who they are? Now, to test this possibility, my colleagues and I looked at dogs. Now, dogs are great for a variety of different reasons, one of which is that they can control their impulses, another of which is that they have no idea who they are. They have no sense of identity. They don't know that they're dogs. And what we did was we set up a situation where we would either deplete dogs of their self-control energy or we did not deplete dogs of their self-control energy. Now, how do you do this? Well, what we did was we simply randomly assigned half of the dogs to sit and stay for 10 minutes. This takes a lot of work, a lot of mental energy. For the other half of the dogs, they were simply told to sit in a kennel for 10 minutes. Next, we gave the dogs a toy. and we put a bunch of food into the toy. And the dogs had learned that they could get food out of this. But on the day of the experiment, we rigged the toy so that they could not get the food out. And we timed how long they persisted in the face of failure. Now, consistent with what we find with humans, when dogs had been depleted of their self-control energy, they gave up a lot sooner. But our second study wanted to extend that in a crucial way. We depleted dogs, or we did not deplete dogs, of their self-control energy. And after that, for half of the dogs, we sprayed some glucose in their mouth. And the other half of the dogs, we sprayed a beverage that was sweet, but that contained no boost of metabolic energy. And as we'd expected, by giving the dogs a boost of metabolic energy, we offset the deficits associated with depleted self-control strength. So what these results show us is that there's a common biological process that can help us explain why people and even non-human animals fail to control their impulses. How can you recharge the self-control system? We've been talking a lot about how self-control does rely on a limited energy resource, but now let's talk about some practical activities that you can take with you and apply to your everyday life that uses what you've learned. These two activities are going to be biological and psychological. When we talk about a biological activity and biological processes that are involved in self-control, we're going to talk about metabolic energy first. The best thing that you can do in terms of starting your day is ensuring that you're giving yourself a boost of metabolic energy. The research literature has been looking at an effect that's called the breakfast effect, about whether it's important to have breakfast in the morning. And dozens of studies have shown that the most important thing about breakfast in the morning is simply whether you have it. So the first activity that I would simply like for you to do over the next week is to have breakfast every single day. Another component that's extremely important is sleep. So if depleted energy undermines our ability to control our impulses, the best way that we can recharge our self-control batteries is to have adequate sleep. To get 7 or 8 or even more hours of sleep is not a bad thing. In fact, it's going to help you achieve your goals. So over the next week, keep track of how much sleep you're getting and how tired you are at the end of the day. And what I'd encourage you to do is to increase the amount of sleep that you're getting if you're feeling tired. So we've talked about a biological activity that you can use to recharge the self-control system, but there are also psychological ways that we can do this. One way that you can do this is to simply think about your core values and beliefs. So every day for the next few days, simply write down what you think are fundamental values that you have in your life. Think about them, and then think about why they're so important to you, why they make you who you are, why they give your life a sense of purpose and meaning, how they help connect you with other people. Now, this affirmation exercise isn't just about making you happy, because studies have shown that it does do that. What's more important for our purposes is by affirming your beliefs and your values, it recharges the self-control energy system. It offsets the negative consequences of being deprived or depleted of your self-control energy. So the next time that you're feeling exhausted, pause and reflect on your most valued attributes, your core beliefs, and why they're important for you. By doing that, you're going to be more able to override your impulses and to exert better self-control. It sounds easy, but it works.